73,000. That is the number. Hold it for a second before moving on, because it is going to mean something different by the time this is over. 73,000 children, documented in British colonial shipping records between 1618 and 1778, transported across the Atlantic Ocean without their parents, without their consent, and in many cases, without any record of what happened to them after the ships arrived. Not orphans in the way the word is commonly understood, children whose parents had died and who needed placement. A significant portion of them had parents who were alive and living in England when the ships left. The children were taken anyway, collected from the streets of London and Bristol and Edinburgh by agents working under contracts issued by municipal authorities, loaded onto vessels, and delivered to colonial labor markets in Virginia, Maryland, the Caribbean, and later the American colonies further north, where they were assigned to households and plantations and put to work under indenture agreements that in practice looked considerably less like apprenticeship and considerably more like the thing that colonial administrators were careful never to call by its name. The orphan trains that Charles Loring Brace organized beginning in 1854 are in the history books. The ships that preceded them by 2 centuries are almost entirely absent from the standard American historical curriculum, and the reason for that absence is not complicated once you look at who ran the earlier system and what it was actually designed to accomplish. The institutional origin of the child transport program was the City of London itself. In 1618, the Common Council of London authorized the collection and transport of what the official documents called vagrant and surplus children from the streets of the city to the Virginia colony, which was at that moment struggling to find a labor supply adequate to the tobacco economy that John Rolfe's cultivation experiments had made suddenly viable. The Virginia Company, which held the colonial charter, had been sending adult indentured servants across the Atlantic since 1607. But adult servants cost more to transport, required more food, and had a tendency to survive long enough to claim the land grants their indenture contracts promised at the end of service. Children were cheaper in every calculation. They cost less to feed on the voyage. They could be bound for longer terms because they were younger. And the mortality rate in the Virginia colony during the 1618 period was high enough that the question of what a child's life would look like at the end of a 7-year indenture was, for many of them, theoretical. The Common Council knew this. The Virginia Company knew this. The contracts they signed with the agents who gathered the children specified price per head, not outcomes. The children targeted by the collection agents were not exclusively orphans, and the records are explicit about this in ways that the later historiography tends to smooth over. The 1618 authorization referred to children who were poor and idle and burdening the city, language that in practice meant any child found on the street without a visible adult guardian, regardless of whether that guardian existed somewhere nearby. Contemporary accounts from London residents describe children being taken from market areas, from churchyards, from the edges of neighborhoods where poor families lived and worked. Some parents complained to city authorities and were told the children had been placed for their own benefit. Some tried to get their children back and were ignored. At least one case from 1620 documents a father who tracked his son to a holding house where children were being kept before embarkation and was turned away by the agents who held the contract. The boys sailed anyway. The father's name is in the complaint record. The son's name is in the shipping manifest. After that, nothing. The legal mechanism that made the program possible rested on a doctrine called parens patriae, a Latin phrase meaning the state as parent, which held that civil authorities had the right and the obligation to intervene in the lives of children whose parents were deemed incapable of providing adequate care. The doctrine was not invented for the child transport program. It had roots in English Chancery Court practice going back to the medieval period, where it had been used primarily to manage the estates of wealthy orphaned minors whose property needed protection. What happened in 1618 was that the City of London applied the doctrine to poor children with no property at all, inverting its original purpose entirely. Instead of protecting children from exploitation by managing their assets, parens patriae became the legal justification for delivering children into labor arrangements that no court would subsequently review because the children had no assets and therefore no standing in the chancery system that might have provided oversight. The doctrine that was designed to protect children from being taken advantage of became the mechanism through which they were taken. The agents who ran the collection operations were private contractors, paid per child, delivered to the embarkation points, which created an incentive structure that the historical record shows produced predictable results. The more children an agent delivered, the more he was paid, with no corresponding accountability for how those children were obtained. City officials who received complaints about wrongful collection had no formal process for investigating them, no mechanism for retrieving a child already in the holding system, and no institutional interest in disrupting a program that solved the city's vagrancy problem and generated fees for the contractors simultaneously. The program ran continuously, with interruptions for war and plague, and the administrative gaps that periodically disrupted all colonial operations, from 1618 through the early 18th century, by which point the Atlantic slave trade had expanded enough that the demand for indentured child labor from England declined, as a cheaper and more permanent labor supply became available. The program did not end because anyone decided it was wrong. It ended because the economics shifted. The demographic consequences of the program in the colonies where the children arrived are documented in the plantation and county records of Virginia and Maryland in a way that genealogists working on colonial American ancestry regularly encounter without necessarily recognizing what they are looking at. Children who arrived under indenture in the 17th century appear in colonial records under names that do not match any English parish record because the agents who collected them frequently renamed them during processing, either to obscure their origins or simply because nobody kept careful records of what they had been called before. They appear in plantation inventories listed alongside livestock and tools. They appear in probate records when the master who held their indenture died and the contract was transferred to an heir along with the rest of the estate. They appear in court records when they ran away, which the surviving documentation shows happened with enough frequency that colonial legislatures passed specific statutes extending the indenture period of a runaway child by a ratio of 5 days for every day of unauthorized absence. A penalty structure that made successful escape economically catastrophic, even for a child close to the end of their term. The children who stayed, survived, completed their indentures, and built lives in the colonies are in some cases the ancestors of families that have been in America since the 1620s and have no idea that the first American in their line arrived at age 9 in the hold of a ship from Bristol without ever having agreed to make the crossing. The connection between the orphan ships and the orphan trains is not metaphorical. It is institutional. Charles Loring Brace knew the history of child transport in the colonial period. He cited earlier precedents in his own writing when defending the Children's Aid Society's program against critics who argued that removing children from their families and sending them to strangers in distant places was inherently harmful, regardless of the stated intentions. Brace's argument was that the practice had worked before, that the colonial period had demonstrated the viability of placing urban children in rural agricultural households, and that the orphan train program was a refinement of a proven method. He did not dwell on the details of how the colonial program had actually operated, but the lineage he was claiming was real. The orphan trains that ran from 1854 to 1929 were not an invention. They were a reactivation, cleaned up for a 19th century reform audience, stripped of the most explicit coercive elements and framed in the language of Christian charity rather than municipal vagrancy management, but drawing on an institutional logic that had been developed and practiced 2 centuries earlier on a larger scale and with considerably less restraint. The records that document the orphan ships are distributed across archives on both sides of the Atlantic and have never been compiled into a single accessible collection. The port books of Bristol and London, held at the Public Record Office in Kew, contain shipping manifests that list child passengers by name, age, and sometimes parish of origin for portions of the program. The Virginia Colonial Records Project has digitized portions of the plantation and county records where the children appear after arrival. The London Metropolitan Archives holds the Common Council minutes, where the program was authorized and periodically reviewed. A researcher who knows where to look and has access to all 3 collections can trace individual children from the streets of London to specific plantations in Virginia across a gap of 6 to 12 weeks. Most genealogists working on colonial American ancestry do not have access to all 3 collections simultaneously, which is one reason the connection between the English origin records and the American arrival records has not been made as often as the evidence would support. What the 73,000 number represents is not a final count. It is a floor. The documented cases, the children who appear in enough records on both sides to be counted with confidence, reach that number. The actual total across the full period of the program, accounting for records that were never kept, records that were lost, records that remain undigitized in local archives, is almost certainly higher. The program ran for a century and a half. It was administered by dozens of different contractors across multiple English cities. It shipped children to multiple colonial destinations. The 73,000 is what survived the archival attrition of 400 years. The rest is in the gap, the same gap that appears in every chapter of this history, between what was done and what was recorded, between what was recorded and what survived, between what survived and what anyone has looked at carefully enough to understand. If a moment in this video stopped you, the father turned away at the embarkation house, the doctrine that flipped from protection to extraction, the number that is a floor, not a ceiling, put it in the comments. Tell us the exact thing. Not a reaction, the specific detail that landed. This community has researchers, genealogists, and people whose family trees dead end in colonial Virginia with no English origin on record. And those threads in the comments are worth more than you might think. If your ancestry runs through the colonial period and you have hit walls that this video might explain, bring what you found. That story belongs here, and it might shape what we cover next. Subscribe if you want to be in this conversation when it continues. We are nowhere near the end of this.